The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, as guardsman James Mitchell took his position outside the iconic gates. For 3 years, he had stood motionless in his bright red uniform and towering bearskin hat, trained never to react to the thousands of tourists who tried everything imaginable to make him smile, laugh, or even blink. But today would be different. James had received devastating news just hours before his shift began. His younger sister, Sarah, only 22 years old, had been involved in a serious car accident. The doctors weren't sure if she would make it through the night. His commanding officer had offered him compassionate leave, but James declined. Sarah had always been so proud of her big brother, the Royal Guard. She would tell anyone who listened about how he protected the Queen herself. As tourists began gathering around the palace gates, snapping photos and making jokes, James focused on his breathing. The weight of his rifle felt heavier than usual, and behind his stoic expression his heart was breaking. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached with her parents. She had bright blonde hair tied in pigtails and wore a princess dress that sparkled in the morning light. The little girl looked up at James with wide, curious eyes. She whispered something to her mother, who smiled and nodded. Then, in a voice barely audible above the chatter of other tourists, the girl said, "Thank you for keeping everyone safe, Mr. Soldier. You're very brave." Her words were simple, innocent, and completely unexpected. Something inside James shifted. This child saw him not as a tourist attraction or a statue to pose beside, but as a person doing an important job. In that moment, he thought of Sarah lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. He thought of all the times she had called him her hero, just like this little girl was doing now. James felt his eyes begin to water behind his bearskin hat. He knew he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't acknowledge the child's words in any way. But the emotion was overwhelming. A single tear rolled down his cheek, barely visible to the crowd but captured by a tourist's camera from just the right angle. The little girl noticed the tear, and her expression changed from curiosity to concern. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a tissue, holding it up toward James. "Are you sad?" she asked softly. Her parents tried to pull her away, embarrassed by the attention they were drawing, but she resisted. More tourists began to notice what was happening. Some laughed, thinking it was part of some performance. Others grew quiet, sensing that something genuine was taking place. James remained perfectly still, but more tears followed the first. The little girl stood there for several more minutes, holding the tissue, waiting patiently as if she understood that sometimes even the bravest soldiers need a moment to feel sad. Finally, her parents succeeded in gently guiding her away, but not before she placed the tissue on the ground near James's feet and whispered, "I hope you feel better soon." As the family disappeared into the crowd, James stared straight ahead, tears continuing to stream down his face. For the first time in his career as a Royal Guard, he had broken character completely, and somehow it felt exactly right. 6 months later, at Windsor Castle, Guardsman Michael Davies was having the most challenging day of his 5-year career. The autumn rain had been falling steadily since dawn, soaking through his uniform and making his bearskin hat feel impossibly heavy. But the weather wasn't what troubled him most. Today marked exactly 1 year since his father had passed away from cancer, and the grief felt as fresh as ever. Michael's father had been his inspiration to join the Queen's Guard. As a child, he would sit mesmerized by his father's stories of military service and duty to country. His father had served in the Royal Navy for 25 years, and had instilled in Michael a deep sense of honor and responsibility. When his father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, his dying wish was to see Michael in his red uniform, standing guard at one of the royal residences. The diagnosis came too late. His father passed away just 3 weeks before Michael completed his training. He never got to see his son fulfill his dream of becoming a Royal Guard. The regret and sadness had haunted Michael every day since, but today it felt particularly overwhelming. A group of elderly veterans approached the castle gates, their military medals gleaming despite the gray weather. They moved slowly, some using walking sticks, others supporting each other as they made their way closer to where Michael stood. One veteran, a man who appeared to be in his 80s, broke away from the group and approached Michael directly. The old man's eyes were sharp and knowing as he studied Michael's face. Without saying a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small military medal. It was worn and tarnished with age, clearly treasured for decades. The veteran held it up so Michael could see it clearly, then pointed to his own chest where similar medals were displayed. "This belonged to my son," the old man said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of loss. "He wanted to be just like you, standing guard for our queen. He never got the chance. Leukemia took him when he was 23, just months before he was supposed to begin training." Michael felt his throat tighten. The parallel between their stories was impossible to ignore. Here was a father who had lost a son with similar dreams, while Michael was a son who had lost a father who shared those same dreams. The veteran continued speaking, oblivious to the cameras and curious onlookers gathering around them. "But seeing you here, standing so proudly in that uniform, it helps me believe that somewhere, somehow, my boy's spirit lives on through soldiers like you. You carry the honor he never got to carry. You serve the duty he never got to serve." The old man's voice cracked slightly as he spoke these words. Michael felt tears begin to well up in his eyes. The veteran's words had touched something deep in his heart, a wound that he thought had begun to heal. He wanted desperately to respond, to thank this man for his kind words, to tell him about his own father's unfulfilled wish. But his training kept him motionless and silent. The elderly veteran seemed to understand. He stepped closer and, in a gesture that surprised everyone watching, he gently placed his son's medal at Michael's feet. "For your father," he whispered, "and for mine." Then he stepped back, stood at attention despite his age, and gave Michael a crisp military salute. That was the moment Michael completely broke character. Tears streamed down his face as he watched this brave old man honor both their losses in such a public way. Other veterans in the group began to notice what was happening, and one by one, they too stepped forward and saluted Michael. For several minutes, Michael stood there crying openly while a group of elderly veterans maintained their salute in the rain. Tourists stopped taking photos and began to realize they were witnessing something sacred and profound. The silence stretched on as the veterans paid their respects, understanding that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from maintaining composure, but from showing genuine human emotion in the face of loss and sacrifice. The spring afternoon at St. James's Palace was bustling with activity as guardsman Robert Chen prepared for what he thought would be a routine shift. Tourists were out in full force, enjoying the warm weather and taking countless photos with the famous guards in their distinctive uniforms. Robert had mastered the art of remaining completely still and emotionless, no matter how loud or silly the tourists became around him. But as Robert took his position, he noticed something unusual happening across the street. A small crowd had gathered around an elderly woman who appeared to be in distress. She was sitting on a bench crying softly while clutching a faded photograph to her chest. Several passers-by had stopped to check on her, but she seemed inconsolable. Through his peripheral vision, Robert could see the woman more clearly. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that were now filled with tears. The photograph she held seemed to be very old, black and white, and she kept looking from the picture to the palace gates where Robert stood. After about 20 minutes, a kind tourist helped the elderly woman to her feet and slowly walked with her toward the palace. As they approached, Robert could hear fragments of their conversation. The woman was speaking about her late husband, about promises made long ago, and about how she had traveled from Australia to be here today. The tourist who was helping her was a middle-aged woman with a gentle voice. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" she asked softly. "It might be too emotional for you." The elderly woman nodded firmly, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "I promised him I would come here. I promised I would tell his story." They stopped directly in front of Robert, and the elderly woman looked up at him with eyes that held decades of love and loss. Her voice was shaky but determined as she began to speak. "My husband was named William Chen. she said. Her Australian accent clear despite her emotional state. He was born in London but moved to Australia when he was young. His father served as a royal guard right here at St. James's Palace in the 1940s. Robert felt his heart skip a beat. Chen was his surname too, though his family was from Hong Kong, not Australia. But the woman's story continued, and what she said next changed everything. William's father was killed in World War II while serving overseas, but not before he made his son promise to come back to London someday and see where he had served. William spent his whole life saving money for that trip, but cancer took him last year before he could make it. I promised him on his deathbed that I would come here in his place. The elderly woman held up the photograph she had been clutching. It showed a young man in a Royal Guard uniform, standing in the exact spot where Robert now stood. The resemblance was unmistakable. The facial features, the stance, even the expression were strikingly similar to Robert's own appearance. His father's name was Chen Wei-ming, the woman continued, tears flowing freely now. I don't know if any records still exist or if anyone remembers him, but William always said he looked just like his father. When I saw you standing there in that uniform for a moment, I thought I was seeing William's father come back to life. Robert felt overwhelmed by emotion. Chen Wei-ming was his great-grandfather's name. His family had always known that their ancestor had served as a royal guard in London before the war, but they had lost touch with that part of their family history. When they moved to Hong Kong, this elderly woman was telling him about his own family, his own blood relative who had stood in this exact spot decades ago. The realization hit Robert like a wave. He was not just doing a job, he was literally following in his great-grandfather's footsteps, continuing a family legacy he had never fully understood. The woman standing before him was, in a strange way, connected to his own family history through marriage and shared stories. Robert's eyes filled with tears as he stared straight ahead, unable to move or speak but desperate to tell this woman that she had found exactly what she was looking for. Chen Wei-ming was his great-grandfather, and William would have been his distant cousin. The photograph she held was of his own ancestor, and her late husband had indeed shared the same bloodline. The elderly woman seemed to sense something had changed in Robert's demeanor. She stepped closer and whispered, "I see it in your eyes. Young man, somehow I think William's father is smiling down on us both right now." She gently placed the old photograph at Robert's feet, just as her husband had always planned to do himself. As she walked away, supported by the kind tourist who had helped her, Robert stood there crying openly, knowing that he had just experienced one of the most profound moments of his life. He was not just a guard protecting a palace, he was part of a continuing story of service, sacrifice, and family legacy that stretched across generations and continents. The December cold at Buckingham Palace was biting, and Guardsman Thomas Williams could feel the chill seeping through his thick uniform as he took his position for the evening shift. Christmas was just 3 days away, and the palace grounds were decorated with stunning lights and festive displays. Tourists were bundled up in winter coats, taking photos and enjoying the magical atmosphere, despite the freezing temperatures. Thomas had been looking forward to this Christmas more than any other in his adult life. After years of difficult relationships and personal struggles, he had finally found the love of his life, Emma, and had been planning to propose to her on Christmas morning. The engagement ring was safely hidden in his flat, and he had spent weeks planning the perfect proposal. Emma had no idea what was coming, and Thomas could barely contain his excitement. But earlier that morning, Thomas had received a phone call that shattered his world. Emma had been diagnosed with a rare brain tumor. The doctors had discovered it during a routine medical check for a persistent headache, and the news was devastating. She would need immediate surgery, and the outcome was uncertain. Emma was scared, and Thomas felt helpless knowing he couldn't be with her as she faced the most frightening moment of her life. As Thomas stood at his post, his mind was miles away in the hospital where Emma was undergoing tests and meeting with specialists. He had wanted to request emergency leave, but Emma had insisted he fulfill his duties. She knew how much his role as a royal guard meant to him, and she didn't want her illness to interfere with his responsibilities. "I'll be brave if you're brave," she had told him over the phone. The evening crowd was smaller due to the cold, But a young couple approached the palace gates holding hands and laughing together. They were clearly in love, probably in their early 20s, and they reminded Thomas painfully of himself and Emma during their early days together. The couple began taking photos of each other in front of the palace, posing and giggling despite the freezing weather. As Thomas watched them, the young man suddenly dropped to one knee right there in the snow. He pulled out a small ring box and began what was obviously a heartfelt proposal. The young woman's hands flew to her face in surprise, and even from his position, Thomas could see tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. She nodded enthusiastically and threw her arms around her new fiancé. The scene was beautiful and romantic, but it was also heartbreaking for Thomas. This was exactly what he had planned to do with Emma in just 3 days. Now, instead of celebrating their engagement, they would be facing surgery and an uncertain future. The contrast between this couple's joy and his own anguish was overwhelming. Other tourists had noticed the proposal and began clapping and cheering for the newly engaged couple. Someone started taking photos, and the moment became a celebration, involving complete strangers who were touched by witnessing such a genuine expression of love. The young woman kept looking at her ring and crying happy tears, while her fiancé held her close. Thomas felt his own tears beginning to fall. The weight of his worry for Emma, combined with seeing this joyful proposal, created an emotional storm inside him that he couldn't control. He thought about all the plans they had made together, all the dreams they had shared, and how fragile life really was. In that moment, he realized that love wasn't about perfect timing or perfect circumstances. It was about choosing to be brave, together, even when facing the unknown. The newly engaged couple noticed Thomas crying and seemed to understand that they were witnessing something deeper than just a guard-breaking character. The young woman approached Thomas carefully and spoke in a soft voice. "Are you thinking about someone special?" she asked gently. "Someone you love?" Thomas couldn't respond, but his tears answered for him. The young woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small Christmas ornament shaped like a heart. It was simple and inexpensive, probably something she had bought as a souvenir, but she placed it carefully at Thomas's feet. "I hope whoever you're thinking about knows how much you love them," she said, "and I hope you get your own happy ending soon." Her new fiancé nodded in agreement and added, "Sometimes the best love stories are the ones where you have to fight for your happy ending." As the couple walked away, still glowing with happiness, Thomas continued to cry openly. Their words had given him a new perspective on his situation with Emma. Instead of seeing her diagnosis as the end of their dreams, he began to see it as the beginning of their greatest adventure together. They would face whatever came next as a team, and their love would be stronger because of the challenges they overcame together. Standing there in the cold December evening, with tears freezing on his cheeks and a stranger's Christmas ornament at his feet, Thomas made a decision. As soon as his shift ended, he would go to the hospital with the engagement ring. He wouldn't wait for the perfect moment or the perfect circumstances. He would propose to Emma exactly where she was, in whatever condition she was in, because their love deserved to be celebrated regardless of what the future might bring. The summer morning at Horse Guards Parade was particularly busy as Guardsman Daniel Thompson prepared for what promised to be a long day of tourists and photo opportunities. The sun was already warm at 9 in the morning, and Daniel knew that, by afternoon, the heat inside his heavy uniform and bearskin hat would be almost unbearable. But he was used to these conditions after 4 years of service, and he took pride in his ability to remain perfectly still and composed, regardless of the weather or circumstances. As Daniel settled into his position, he noticed a familiar figure in the growing crowd of tourists. It was Mrs. Margaret Foster, an elderly woman who had been coming to see the guards almost every day for the past 2 months. She always stood in the same spot, always wore the same faded blue dress, and always carried the same worn leather handbag. Daniel had noticed her because, unlike other tourists, she never took photos or tried to get his attention. She simply stood quietly and watched, sometimes for hours at a time. Today, Mrs. Foster looked different. She seemed frailer than usual, and she was leaning heavily on a walking stick that Daniel hadn't seen before. Her usually neat appearance was slightly disheveled, and there was something in her expression that suggested she was struggling with something much deeper than physical discomfort. After standing in her usual spot for about an hour, Mrs. Foster slowly made her way closer to where Daniel was positioned. She moved carefully, as if each step required considerable effort. When she was close enough that Daniel could hear her clearly, she began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My grandson would have been your age today," she said, looking directly at Daniel even though she knew he couldn't respond. "Today is his birthday. He would have been 25 years old." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke these words, and Daniel could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Mrs. Foster continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her story. "His name was Peter, and he dreamed of being a royal guard just like you. He had posters of the guards all over his bedroom wall when he was little. He used to practice standing perfectly still for hours, pretending he was protecting the Queen." Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest as he listened to Mrs. Foster's words. He could sense where this story was heading, and his heart began to break for this lonely old woman who had been coming to see him every day. "Peter joined the army when he turned 18, Mrs. Foster continued. "He was so excited, so proud to be serving his country. He wrote to me every week from Afghanistan, telling me about his training and his plans to apply for the Queen's Guard when his tour was finished. He was supposed to come home last Christmas." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Daniel understood now why Mrs. Foster came every day, why she stood in the same spot and watched with such intensity. She was seeing her grandson in every guard who stood at attention, imagining the future that Peter would never have. "I know you can't talk to me," Mrs. Foster said, her tears now flowing freely. "But I need you to know that Peter would have been just like you. Brave, dedicated, proud to serve. When I look at you standing there so perfectly, I can pretend for a little while that Peter made it home, that he got to fulfill his dream." Daniel felt his own tears beginning to fall. The weight of representing this woman's lost grandson, of being a symbol of all the dreams that Peter would never achieve, was overwhelming. He thought about his own grandmother, how proud she was of his service, and how devastated she would be if something happened to him. Mrs. Foster reached into her handbag and pulled out a small military photograph. It showed a young man in army uniform smiling broadly at the camera. The resemblance to Daniel was striking. They had similar hair color, similar build, and the same determined expression in their eyes. "This is Peter," she said, holding the photograph up so Daniel could see it clearly. "I brought this for you to see because I wanted you to know who you represent when you stand there. You're not just protecting the palace. You're carrying the dreams of all the young men and women who wanted to serve but never got the chance." Mrs. Foster placed the photograph at Daniel's feet, just as others had done in similar moments of connection. But then she did something unexpected. She stepped back, stood as straight as her aged body would allow, and gave Daniel a crisp salute. It was the salute of a military family member, someone who understood the sacrifice and dedication required for service. "Happy birthday, my dear Peter," she whispered. "Your grandmother loves you and she's proud of the soldier you became, even if you never got to wear this uniform." Daniel completely lost his composure at that moment. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that Mrs. Foster had been coming to see him not just as entertainment or curiosity, but as a way to stay connected to her grandson's memory. Every day for 2 months, she had stood in that same spot and honored Peter's unfulfilled dream by watching Daniel fulfill his own. Other tourists began to notice what was happening, and gradually the area around Daniel grew quiet. People stopped taking photos and started to understand that they were witnessing something sacred. Mrs. Foster remained standing at attention for several more minutes, her salute unwavering despite her physical frailty. When she finally lowered her arm, Mrs. Foster smiled through her tears and nodded at Daniel. "Thank you for letting an old woman pretend just for a while that her grandson made it home." Then she turned and slowly walked away, leaving Peter's photograph at Daniel's feet as a permanent reminder of the dreams and sacrifices that his uniform represented. The autumn evening at Windsor Castle carried a crisp chill as Guardsman Alexander Reed took his final position as a royal guard. After 8 years of dedicated service, tomorrow would mark his last day in the famous red uniform. Alex had mixed feelings about leaving. While he was excited about starting his new career as a teacher, he knew he would deeply miss the honor and responsibility that came with protecting the royal family. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the ancient castle walls, Alex reflected on all the moments that had shaped his time as a guard. He had witnessed countless ceremonies, met visitors from around the world, and had stood through every type of weather imaginable. But more than anything, he had learned about the power of human connection, even when that connection had to remain unspoken. A small group of tourists approached the castle gates, and Alex noticed they were all wearing matching t-shirts that read, "Make-A-Wish Foundation." Leading the group was a young boy who appeared to be about 10 years old. He was thin and pale, clearly battling a serious illness, but his eyes sparkled with excitement as he looked up at Alex in his impressive uniform. The boy's parents stayed close beside him, their faces showing the careful balance of joy and worry that Alex had learned to recognize in families facing difficult times. A woman with a Make-A-Wish volunteer badge approached the group and began explaining the history of the castle and the role of the royal guards. But the young boy wasn't paying attention to the historical facts. He was completely focused on Alex, studying every detail of his uniform, his posture, and his ceremonial rifle. After several minutes of intense observation, the boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something in her ear. The mother smiled sadly and shook her head, but the boy persisted. Finally, she approached the Make-A-Wish volunteer and had a quiet conversation. The volunteer nodded and walked over to where Alex was standing. "Excuse me," the volunteer said softly, positioning herself where Alex could hear clearly. "The young man over there is named Jamie, and his wish was to come here and meet a real royal guard. He's been battling leukemia for 2 years, and this trip to see you is the thing he's been most excited about." Alex felt his heart tighten as he looked at Jamie, who was now waving shyly from where he stood with his parents. The boy's courage and enthusiasm in the face of such a serious illness was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "Jamie wanted me to tell you something," the volunteer continued. "He said that when he grows up, he wants to be brave just like you. He practices standing at attention in his hospital room, and he's been learning everything he can about the royal guards. He knows you can't talk to him, but he wanted you to know that you're his hero." Alex felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. On his last evening as a royal guard, he was being reminded of exactly why this job had meant so much to him. It wasn't just about protecting buildings or following protocol. It was about representing something larger than himself, something that could inspire hope and courage in others. Jamie slowly approached Alex, moving carefully but with determination. When he was close enough, he stood as straight as his weakened body would allow and attempted to salute. His form wasn't perfect, but his effort was sincere and deeply moving. "Thank you for being so brave," Jamie said in a clear voice that carried across the courtyard. "I hope someday I can be as strong as you are." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toy soldier dressed as a royal guard. It was obviously well loved, with paint worn off in places from being handled so frequently. "This is my favorite toy," Jamie explained, placing the soldier at Alex's feet. "I carry him everywhere, even to my treatments at the hospital. He helps me remember to be brave when things get scary. I want you to have him because I think maybe you get scared sometimes too, and everyone needs someone to help them be brave." The wisdom and generosity of this young boy completely overwhelmed Alex. Here was a child facing one of life's greatest challenges, yet he was thinking about comforting others and sharing his most precious possession. The contrast between Jamie's physical frailty and his enormous emotional strength was profound and moving. Alex began crying openly, unable to maintain his stoic composure in the face of such pure courage and kindness. Jamie seemed to understand that his words had touched something deep in Alex's heart. The boy smiled and stepped back to rejoin his parents, who were also crying as they watched their son's interaction with his hero. Other tourists had gathered around to witness this extraordinary exchange, and many of them were wiping away tears as well. The Make-A-Wish volunteer explained to the crowd what was happening, and soon everyone understood they were seeing something truly special. For the remaining hour of his shift, Alex stood with Jamie's toy soldier at his feet, tears continuing to flow as he processed the profound gift he had just received. This brave young boy had reminded him that being a royal guard wasn't just about duty and tradition. It was about inspiring others to find their own courage in difficult times. Alex prepared to leave his post for the final time. He carefully picked up Jamie's toy soldier. He knew that long after he had hung up his red uniform, he would carry with him the memory of this extraordinary boy who had taught him that true bravery comes not from being fearless, but from choosing to be kind and generous even when facing your greatest fears. Jamie had given him a gift that would last a lifetime, and Alex knew that in his new career as a teacher, he would spend every day trying to inspire that same kind of courage in his students.